Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ella, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Let's Get Real, HIV and Aging at a Glance. This webinar is taking place on June 4th, 2026. We are recording the webinar today so that we can share it with people who are not able to attend. This webinar is organized by the Manitoba HIV-STBBI Collective Impact Network. This is a network of innovators working collaboratively to transform the landscape of HIV and STBBIs in Manitoba. We bring people together to tackle complex HIV and STBBI systems barriers, and we seek systems change by shifting the conditions that are holding the problems in place. If you would like to find out more about the Collective Impact Network, sign up to receive our newsletter, or find our social media and YouTube page, you can do so at cinetwork.ca. This webinar is part of our ongoing efforts to provide HIV prevention education, and you can find past resources on our YouTube page. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 1, Winnipeg, Manitoba. We acknowledge that we work and gather on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Lakota, Inuit, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We are humbly working together towards the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls for action and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry's calls for justice through our research, events, and projects of the Manitoba HIV-STBBI Collective Impact Network. I want to note that this webinar is a direct action resulting from gaps identified by long-term survivors and by service providers on the need for HIV education. Tomorrow, June 5th, is HIV Long-Term Survivors Awareness Day, and Sunday, June 7th, is the Winnipeg Pride Rally. And one of our panelists today, who you'll hear from later, is Jim Kane, one of the Grand Marshals for the rally this year, and who marched with 25 other people in the very first Pride Rally in 1987. So for today, we will have a presentation from Realize, followed by reflections from three people with lived experience, and then a Q&A. For the question and answer period after the presentation today, we ask that you type your questions into the Q&A feature. You can type a question at any time, and our presenters will be taking breaks to answer those questions, and then we will have a full Q&A following both the presentation and the panel. So without further ado, I will let our Realize team take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ella. Can everybody hear me okay? Just thumbs up if you're perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Jocelle Refol. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the HIV and Aging Initiatives lead at Realize. I'll just pass it off quickly to Christina to introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Jocelle. I'm Christina Lessels. I'm the Community-Based Research Coordinator at Realize.
Thanks, Christina. And today we also have Ken, Jim, and Rebecca, who will introduce themselves later on during the community panel, but I'm also very grateful to have them join us here today. And okay, we'll just get started. Before we start, I do want to respectfully acknowledge that the Realize office sits on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, colonially referred to as Toronto. Christina?
And I'm also based in Toronto, but this week I have the privilege of joining the webinar from Vancouver, situated on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Thanks, Christina. And today, as we are discussing HIV and aging, I want to explicitly name how Indigenous populations have been made systemically vulnerable to HIV through ongoing colonial oppression. And so as we go throughout our present today, I really encourage folks on this call, on this webinar, to keep in mind how these issues are disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities and what data, information, or action is missing in order to advance health equity in this sector. I also want to acknowledge that Christina and I do not have lived experience with HIV, and in our work at Realize, we really strive to embody the narratives of Nothing About Us Without Us, which is the meaningful involvement of people living with HIV in all that we do. And so our role here today is to not act as experts, but rather as individuals involved in this really important knowledge sharing process of these important topics. And in spirit of that, as I mentioned, we have Ken, Jim, and Rebecca today to share the reflections reflections with us based on this presentation, and hopefully engage in some great conversation as well with any questions that you might have. And we're also really grateful to have the invitation from Nine Circles to present this webinar. So in case you're not familiar with Realize, we are a national nonprofit. Our goal is to foster positive change for people living with HIV and other episodic disabilities. And just very briefly at Realize, the term episodic disabilities is used to refer to disabilities with periods of wellness, periods of illness, and that unpredictability. And so we were established in 1998, and our goal is to improve the daily lives of people living with HIV and other episodic disabilities in direct and meaningful ways through research, education, and policy change. And so in this webinar today, we will provide a very basic overview of the context of HIV and aging in Canada, outline some best practices and considerations for supporting people aging with HIV, highlight current realized resources and research studies on this topic, and also just provide the space for community members to share their experiences and thoughts. I do want to mention or provide a disclaimer that Christina and I are not frontline service providers within the healthcare sector. So if you have any specific questions around HIV and aging regarding like medical advice, we're unable to answer that for you, but of course we're able to help seek those answers if you would like that. Okay, so this first section is on HIV in Canada today, new diagnoses, and I'll invite Ella to launch our first poll. And so the purpose of the polls for this section is just to kind of gauge the level of interest in the room and help me prioritize my presentation in terms of content. So the first poll question that you should have pop up is true or false, HIV and AIDS are the same thing. And I'll just wait on you, Ella, to decide when to close the poll, and then we can see the results if that's okay. 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 Well, everybody here has this same baseline knowledge. It is false. HIV and AIDS are not the same thing. So thank you so much for participating. So as you all may know already, HIV is the acronym for human immunodeficiency virus, and there are two stages of infection, acute and chronic. So the acute infection stage refers to the 2 to 4 weeks of exposure when the virus is beginning to quickly replicate in the blood. And so in order to fight off the virus, the body has to create those antibodies. And so if the virus is not being addressed, the viral load, this can begin the chronic infection stage, which is the rate at which virus replication begins to slow down because of those HIV antibodies, but without treatment, that viral load can begin to increase. And then AIDS is the acronym for acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which is the most advanced stage of HIV due to the severe damage to the immune system. And in general, this term is not used because it contributes to the stigma and misinformation towards HIV when it is in fact a treatable and eventually untransmittable condition. Okay, we'll have two polls for this. If you're not seeing a poll, it might just be the device that you're using, but I'll read out the true or false question. So just in case you're not seeing the poll, you can reflect on your answer. So, but thank you for noting that. So one of the true or false questions is unprotected anal or vaginal sex is the most common way HIV is transmitted from person to person. And the second true or false question is HIV can be transmitted through bodily fluids such as saliva, tears, sweat, urine, and feces. So we'll give some time for folks to answer that. All right, so unprotected anal or vaginal sex is the most common way HIV is transmitted from person to person. This is true, but of course this varies in provincial context. There might be some routes of transmission that are more prevalent. HIV can be transmitted through bodily fluids such as saliva, tears, sweat, urine, and feces. This is false. So we actually have not a 50-50 split. We do have some folks that are learning some new information, so this is great. So I'll just advance my slides here. So for HIV to be transmitted, there must be sufficient viral load in the blood and certain bodily fluids, such as those from the genitals, as well as in anal secretions and chest milk. So for example, one of the items that was listed or bodily fluids listed in the true or false was saliva. So that HIV cannot be transmitted through saliva. And when there's a detectable viral load in the blood and the bodily fluids that we talked about on the screen, common routes of transmission are sex without protection, vertical transmission, so from mother to child, or the sharing of injection equipment like needles or filters. And key ways to prevent HIV transmission is by using condoms, accessing antiretroviral treatment like pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis, PrEP and PEP, and routine precautions like testing. And then there's also the science behind undetectable equals untransmittable, U equals U, which is also a key method of HIV prevention, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So the last poll for this section is true or false, a person living with HIV who is on active treatment and has an undetectable viral load in the blood are unable to transmit the virus sexually or vertically or from parent to child. Right. Okay, let's see. Okay, so the majority answered true, which is correct. Thank you so much for participating. I'm glad there's some good level of baseline knowledge in the room as well. So when we talk about prevention, U equals U is a key message used to promote the uptake of antiretroviral therapy and also address the stigma regarding HIV. So the evidence shows that an individual who is actively on antiretroviral treatments for at least 6 months and have an undetectable level of the virus results in the virus being sexually untransmittable, regardless if a condom is used or not. And this is very important for HIV prevention. But there are still a number of barriers with accessing treatment, such as immigration status or access according to your geographical area. And so along with U equals U, there is also V does not equal V. So viral load does not indicate one's value. And a person living with HIV is not defined by their viral load in their laboratory results, given all of these other factors that can be barriers to treatment. So HIV, U equals U is a really important a message in order to address the stigma towards HIV and to also promote more uptake of treatment as prevention. See if we have any questions. No. Okay. So now I'll be spending some time to review the surveillance data of new diagnoses of HIV in Canada at the end of 2024. So at the end of 2024, there were 1,826 new diagnoses of HIV in Canada, excluding data from Quebec. And so the national rate of HIV in Canada was 5.7 per 100,000 people in the population. And this report also shows the provinces with the highest diagnosis rates being Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And so as we were invited by Nine Circles, a Manitoba-based community organization, I want to take the time to recognize the recent declaration of an emergency over the steady rising cases of HIV in the province and the call among Indigenous community members for an Indigenous-led response. And so as a national organization, we also call attention to this and the recognition of how systemic racism and the social determinants of health, like income, housing, and race, have contributed to the higher number of new HIV cases in Manitoba. And I'm really looking forward to hear from our community panelists on their reflections on this as well. But before we get into more on disproportionate impacts, we'll look further into this data set. So the data also shows the breakdown of new cases according to biological sex. So 46.1% of diagnoses for males was from male-to-male sexual contact, and 24.2% was from heterosexual contact. And for females, 47.3% of new diagnoses were attributed to heterosexual contact. Between females and males, there was a higher percentage of females who were exposed through injection drug use at 37.2% versus 13.6% of exposures in men. But for men, there was that additional exposure of male-to-male sexual contact and injection drug use, which made up about 3.8% of new HIV diagnoses. And within the Manitoba context, the increase in new HIV infections is largely attributed to injection drug use and heterosexual sex. I will note that for this data set from the government, there is no specific category for transgender and gender diverse individuals, so that is a limitation to note. They are likely included in the overall section in the distribution of new HIV diagnoses, so that is a limitation in learning more about these new diagnoses. And lastly, for this data, I want to draw attention to distribution among age groups. And so although there is a peak between those 25 to 39, what I really want to focus on, and is the focus on this presentation, are those who are over the age of 60, because there's often an assumption that people who are aging, specifically among healthcare providers as well, the older aging folks are not having sex, but that's incorrect. So as a result, viruses that can be transmitted through sex are still a concern for people who are aging. And so we are not only seeing people aging with HIV from a younger age, but we're also seeing people being infected as they grow older. So it's important to note that also because of those assumptions among healthcare providers that older adults are not having sex or not using drugs, that they are likely receiving their HIV diagnosis quite later in the disease onset, which would have been critical for that treatment period. I think there was a question, but it should be okay. And then returning back to disproportionate impacts of HIV in Canada, as previously mentioned. So one group that is impacted are those who inject drugs. So in 2020, people who injected drugs made up 16.1% of all people living with HIV in Canada. And that's averaging about 239 infections per 100,000 in the year, compared to 4 infections per 100,000 among the general population. For Indigenous folks who are disproportionately impacted, in 2020, 10.3% of all people living with HIV were Indigenous folks or are Indigenous folks. And despite this population approximately making about 5% of the overall population, according to census data, you see that this is very disproportionate. So recognizing, colonialism, racism, social exclusion, and suppression of self-determination as key social determinants of health that have resulted in this vulnerability to HIV. And then there are also inequities among African, Caribbean, and Black populations. So in Ontario, according to 2015 data, which is quite a decade ago, ACB populations made up about 25% of HIV infections, despite representing about 5% of this provincial population. So again, very disproportionate impacts. And this was largely due to experiences of racism in the healthcare that creates barriers in HIV testing, in care, sexual health. And we can also see further inequities within the population, such as among Black women living with HIV who have a 5 times higher risk of dying from HIV/AIDS compared to their male counterparts. So all of this to talk about that, when it comes to HIV and aging, we recognize there has been this shift in focusing on the aging piece, but we also have to recognize that there is an inequity in who is able to age with HIV and what that aging looks like. So for people living with HIV stigma is not the only concern. Depending on their lived experience, they might be facing other types of stigma, and that could be toward gender or sexual identity, race, ethnicity, engagement in sex work, homelessness, poverty, mental illness, drug use, and history of incarceration. And so all of these are important to consider when working with people living with HIV, since everyone's experiences may be different. And this also highlights that in addressing forms of oppression like sexism, like homophobia, racism, we can also improve the lives of people living with HIV at these intersections, because HIV stigma is not a single system issue. We'll now be pivoting to aging with HIV more in focus. I just want to double check if there are any questions in the chat or Q&A. Nope. Okay. Oh, perfect. Someone said PHAG published data with Quebec. Okay, thank you for highlighting that. That's great. All right, so aging with HIV in Canada. So in contrast to the beginning of the HIV epidemic, people with HIV are aging thanks to advancements in medications such as combination antiretroviral therapy and much more. So with better treatments, HIV is being treated and understood as a chronic illness. And there's also the advancements around U equals U, and the life expectancy for people aging with HIV are approaching those who are HIV negative. But of course, comorbidities remain a challenge. And we also can't operate on the assumption that all people living with HIV have the privilege to age or are aging the same. And so this is the work to do with all of these different challenges. So there is stigma, internal and external, ageism, especially among older adults, physical changes, so chronic inflammation, immune dysfunction, accelerated aging phenotypes, meaning aging earlier, increase in geriatric syndromes like frailty, and there's also underlying challenges to aging, like systemic challenges and fear and uncertainty. And in specific to Manitoba context, challenges with houselessness, injection drug use, economic instability, which I think is also challenges we see all across Canada, including here in Ontario. And so in general, people with HIV who are aging with HIV experience a double stigma. So first and foremost, HIV stigma continues to persist due to misinformation in the early epidemic, and that can become eventually internalized. And then the second stigma, ageism, can affect different facets of one's life and sense of belonging. And this includes in aid services organizations. So many people aging with HIV have shared how they no longer feel as included in ASOs, and because there's often been a shift in focusing on younger people living with HIV or those who are at risk. And then there's also those societal pressures or perceptions of sexual inactivity, normalized isolation, which can delay someone seeking support, such as seeking care regarding their sexual health or being able to pursue other connections and relationships. And then people aging with HIV also experience more comorbidities as they age. So an individual with comorbidities is someone who has more than one condition. And since HIV is a chronic health condition, a person aging with HIV is likely experiencing additional health complications or diseases at the same time. So in this pyramid, at the bottom, we see that people living long-term with HIV over the age of 50 and people living with HIV over the age of 50 tend to have more comorbidities than their HIV negative counterparts or HIV positive younger peers. So what are some examples of these comorbidities? So people living with HIV are twice as likely to have a cardiovascular disorder compared to people living without HIV. So this, for example, would be high blood pressure. There's also a risk for frailty and fractures with age, especially for women living with HIV regarding osteoporosis. And a risk factor for this is the loss of muscle mass and strength, and polypharmacy can have an impact. And polypharmacy is having to take multiple medications at the same time, and there could be interactions between those medications, but there can also be changes in how a person's body responds. There are and it's an increased incidence of diabetes. So for men, this especially is the case, or this tends to be the case for those who were treated with earlier medications. And for women, newer medications that preserve bone density and are safer for the kidneys have been shown to have an increase in BMI and also diabetes diagnoses. And then challenges around cognitive health, so HIV-associated neurocognitive disorder and social isolation can exaggerate or exacerbate the risk for cognitive impairment. And so in 2019, Realize actually conducted a study focused on people aging with HIV in Ontario. We love our acronyms, so it's called the PANASH study. It's the preferences and needs for aging care among HIV positive elderly people in Ontario. And this was a qualitative, community-based participatory research study where we engaged 9 community-based organizations across Ontario to identify what these preferences and needs for aging care are. And the reason that this study came to light is it came from the community. A lot of them shared how no one really knew what older adults living with HIV wanted as they grew older and needed as well. And so, although the experiences for people aging with HIV will vary, there were universal experiences like trauma, stigma, and fear and uncertainty that undermined the quote unquote normal aging process. So, for trauma, many of those living with HIV long term had experienced struggles across their lifetime around treatment, losing loved ones, disconnection. And this is when the emphasis on a life course approach when caring for people aging with HIV is really important. And so a life course approach is understanding maybe the various social or medical turning points in history that might have influenced their experience. And then for stigma, as we've mentioned, having experienced external stigma for so long, this may have resulted in some folks internalizing their stigma and impacting their mental health and their self-worth. And that can also affect their ability to be able to trust healthcare professionals and seek care due to concerns of discrimination. And finally, around fear and uncertainty, this stemmed from not knowing how they will feel the next day. So that episodic nature that we talked about realizes focus. So, and not knowing also if they'll be able to continue to meet their basic needs. So just that fear and uncertainty of not really knowing what the next couple of days will bring. Oh no, I don't know what happened to my quotes, but these are some quotes from the studies and I'll read them out because I don't know what happened. But the quote on the left, it says, I was 65 in September and I've been on ODSP, which is Ontario Disability Support Program, for the last few years, and I'm fortunate to live in a co-op. But the finances will pretty much stay the same. And it's been a very challenging experience to live on ODSP. So the future living unendlessly in reduced circumstances of finances is a very miserable future. So around that fear and uncertainty piece of focusing on finances was a huge stressor for some participants. For this quote on the right, it says, I wasn't really worried about anything HIV was going to do to me. It was really obvious to me that though I had to be more concerned about things that my fellow human beings might do to me because of my HIV status. But because of my politics, because of my sexual orientation, because of a lot of things, I was already targeted by the same people who weaponize HIV against LGBT people. And so this person is kind of sharing about that intersections piece of not being worried about what the virus will do to their body, but more focused on the multiple stigmas that they're experiencing. And this relates to these pieces around concerns for accessing aging care. And so as there is an increase in people aging with HIV and they're developing different comorbidities as they age as part of that normal aging process, many are likely going to need support to manage, especially for those without informal caregivers and might be facing challenges to aging at home. But seeking those services can bring a lot of hesitation because HIV stigma is still a huge issue, especially in the healthcare system, especially in long-term care. And when you add the layers of additional stigmas like towards sexual orientation, a lot of people living with HIV, part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, are worried about having to go back into the closet in order to receive this care. And so this is just one example of how it's really important that healthcare providers, folks who are supporting people who are aging, are ready to support populations who are aging with HIV. And what does that look like? Okay. So now we're transitioning into best practices for supporting people aging with HIV. And this is definitely not comprehensive. These are just some places to start in how to approach compassion and stigma-free care in your roles. And I know we have kind of a mix of folks in their roles. So of course, this might not be applicable to everyone, but maybe it might be applicable to someone on your team. So first, I want to highlight a very common misconception in personal care settings. And so first and foremost, it's really important to make sure your team is knowledgeable and educated about HIV basics, like the polls that we did today, and addressing any outdated stigmas and beliefs. And so one common concern, specifically in long-term care settings or personal care settings, is wondering if someone can contract HIV through physical contact, which we know from the beginning of this presentation is incorrect. Occupational transmission is extremely rare in Canada because due to strict infection protocols, and we have immediate availability of PrEP and PEP for those who are exposed, but also the most common route of transmission is through sex and equipment used for drugs. So this is not possible. So it's really important to address these misconceptions, and this is work that Realize does. So if you're interested in being able to get some education for your team, feel free to connect with us. Another thing that you can do is referring to a geriatrician. So we know that people living long-term with HIV tend to experience aging in the body sooner. And so usually adults over the age of 65 are the ones referred to a geriatrician, but people aging with HIV might benefit from an earlier referral because a geriatrician will assess functional status, cognitive function, mental health, polypharmacy, and deprescribing. So being able to identify if there are, additional medications that are being taken that don't need to be taken, falls and bone health, social determinants, addressing social determinants and caregiver support, and advanced care planning. Of course, this will largely depend on, the provincial healthcare system, regional access, where someone lives, but this is just a consideration, and keeping an eye out for things that are part of the, regular aging process, but a bit earlier on among people aging with HIV. But of course, even with a referral, even with support, it's also important to recognize the cross-disciplinary nature of HIV care and focusing on the whole person. So not only are we supporting the physical health of people aging with HIV, but also addressing other components like food and housing, which I'm sure some folks on this call might be in these different types of roles, and figuring out how we can best work together. And just to wrap up before I pass it off to Christina here, is that some other approaches, bottom line, it's important to establish trust, using preferred language and not perpetuating stigma, such as through the overuse of PPE, if that's a role that you find yourself in. And also there are some cases, or there are likely cases, when HIV is actually not the most important concern for a person living with HIV, and they might be focused on other parts of their life. So it's very helpful to be informed of local services, support other areas, and overall, making sure that we're approaching this from a compassion and stigma-free approach, because at the bottom line, you want to treat someone like a human and that they feel cared for. Yeah, that's a lot of content on my end, and a lot to digest, so happy to address questions later on, but I'll pass it off to Christina.
Thanks, Jocelle, and thank you so much, Ella and Nine Circles, for this opportunity to speak about Realize's research on HIV and aging. And today I'm just briefly going to highlight two current projects: financial empowerment for healthy aging with HIV in Ontario, and the National Panache Survey. So Realize's research approach embodies nothing about us without us, which Jocelle described at the start of the webinar, in that our research employs community-based and participatory methods. Community members with lived experience and representatives from community-based HIV organizations, or CBHOs or ASOs, are a critical part of the cross-sector research teams that guide the project. Community members are engaged in all aspects of the study activities, from informing the overarching research direction, questions, and protocols, participating in the development of the research tools and other project materials, supporting recruitment, outreach, and promotion, data analysis, and knowledge sharing. And for the Panache study, which I'll discuss in a moment, there's also a team of peer community researchers working on the project, who, in addition to their work on the research team, are also facilitating surveys with community members. And our values and way of working are guided by community-based research principles, including the work is community-driven and relevant, built on equitable and collaborative partnerships. We incorporate capacity building for all team members into all of our project activities. Our work is guided by an anti-oppression framework. We value multiple forms of knowledge, including the diverse experiences and perspectives of all individuals engaged in the research. And we're dedicated to moving research to action through our knowledge mobilization activities and resources. And before I go any further, I just wanted to acknowledge the community members, research team members, community organizations, and other partners who have made the research carried out by Realize possible. So the aim of the financial empowerment study, is to learn about the financial empowerment needs of people living with HIV who are 50 years and older in Ontario, about whether financial resources, services, and supports are readily available and accessible. This study is funded by the Ontario HIV Treatment Network and is guided by a cross-sector research team, including community members. So financial empowerment is a critical area of focus for addressing the systemic inequalities faced by communities impacted by HIV. Among older people living with HIV in Ontario, financial insecurity poses a significant barrier to a healthy and dignified aging process. Research indicates that almost 40% of older people living with HIV in Ontario live below the low income cutoff, facing challenges in meeting their basic needs, including food, shelter, and clothing. So the Panache, Ontario study, which Jocelle already introduced, so I won't go into further detail into introducing that study, introduced financial insufficiency as a major stressor for the population and a key contributor to uncertainty in aging. Participant narratives revealed gaps in financial literacy and barriers to financial inclusion. And these challenges, as Jocelle described, are compounded by systemic barriers, including fragmented services, gaps in government assistance policies, stigma, discrimination, and socioeconomic inequities. So in response to these findings, this financial empowerment study was developed and undertook the first comprehensive needs assessment of financial literacy, access to financial services, and unmet financial planning and system navigation needs among aging and older people living with HIV in Ontario. We launched the study in 2024 with a data collection plan that included an online survey for community members and focus groups with service providers at CBHOs. Unfortunately, we had to close the survey prematurely due to the interference of AI bots, which is a pervasive issue in online research. So we were unable to analyze the compromised community, the data gathered from community members. And despite this disappointing experience, we were able to develop findings and recommendations and knowledge mobilization products based on the focus groups conducted with the service providers. And I'll describe that in a little bit more detail shortly. We also had a lot of lessons learned about bots. So we were able to apply that to our data collection strategy for the Panache national study. And as well, we've been sharing our lessons learned widely, such as the Canadian HIV Research Conference CAR. Last year, we had a poster presentation for the Financial Empowerment Project around bots. And this year, we hosted an ancillary event at CAR in Winnipeg, focused on community perspectives on AI in HIV research. And if anybody's interested in engaging, that was our initial conversation, and we're looking to develop a resource from that, was sort of started at that workshop. If you're interested in being a part of these conversations, please connect with me after the workshop. My email address is on the last slide. So as I mentioned, as a result of the bot issues, the voices of older people living with HIV were left out of this initial study findings. As such, we applied for and received funding from OHTN to relaunch the community member survey this year. So we're really excited that shortly, by the end of the spring, early summer, we will be launching that survey again for community members with a data collection period of around 8 months. And then we'll be able to bring together those findings from this community survey together with the findings from the initial focus groups with service providers to develop a more comprehensive set of findings, recommendations, from which we'll also develop our knowledge sharing tools and resources to build on what we've already developed from the first phase of the study. So engaging with service providers at the CBHOs allowed the study to learn from their experiences supporting older people living with HIV to navigate benefit programs and access financial information and services. And it is very clear the extensive efforts that staff at CBHOs are undertaking to support their community members to access financial supports and navigate financial and benefit systems and information. Briefly, our key takeaways from these focus groups include systemic barriers need addressing related to complexity in benefits, discrimination, and fragmented services. Long-term financial security is the goal. Short-term aids are helpful, but financial empowerment is key. Aging with HIV requires tailored support, a focus on financial, health, and housing support for aging individuals. Service coordination is essential. Collaboration across organization is crucial. Financial literacy improves stability. Simplifying access to benefits and information for individuals is key. As well, mental health integration, combining financial security with mental health care improves well-being. And just quickly, from these findings, we developed short, medium, and long-term recommendations for government agencies, financial, social, and healthcare sectors, and community organizations. And an overview of these key recommendations include streamlining financial empowerment information and programs, reforming government assistance policies and processes, combating stigma and discrimination within financial, health, and social service sectors, and enhancing service coordination and cross-sector collaboration. So I encourage you to take a look at the executive summary that's available at this QR code on the financial empowerment page on Realize's website to learn more about the key findings and recommendations. And from our findings, we've also developed the resources you see listed here, a guide to support older people living with HIV in Ontario to access financial information or resources, and another guide to help service providers support clients in finding reliable financial information. And we also have available a printable reference card that was developed by master's students for their coursework in the fall for this study, focused on supporting clients to navigate that transition to retirement benefits at age 65. So quickly, I want to highlight the Panache National Study. Thanks, Jocelle. So Panache is the first ever survey in Canada on HIV and aging. And the goal of this community-based research study is to gather information from people aging with HIV in Canada who are 60 years and older about their current and anticipated healthcare and social needs and preferences. We're seeking to include over 300 people across Canada in the study, and enrollment is currently open for community members to enroll. As the population of older adults living with HIV continues to grow, there is a need for Canadian data that meaningfully examines not only health status, but also the broader social, structural, and service-related factors that shape quality of life and aging experiences. The information that we gather during this study will help us to make program and policy recommendations about what kinds of services and resources would be most useful to older adults living with HIV in Canada. So this study is funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and is co-led by our colleague at Realize, Kate Merzin, as well as Dr. Sharon Walmsley in Toronto. And it builds, of course, on the original Panache, Ontario study. So at this link, the QR code, there is, if you scroll down the page, there is information about the original Panache, Ontario study, which I welcome you to go take a look. You can read through the Panache, Ontario community report, as well as there's some really awesome videos of research team meeting members from the original study speaking about the Panache, Ontario study and HIV and aging. So that's also posted on that site. But this link here will take you to the main page for the Panache National Survey. As I mentioned, it's a community-based research study. So there is a team of community researchers located across the country who are facilitating surveys virtually or by phone with people who would prefer to do the survey with supports as opposed to completing the survey independently online. But people have that choice of how they would like to complete the survey. And the survey, it's long. It takes about 90 minutes, give or take, to complete. But people have the opportunity to stop and start and as much as they like. They do not need to sit down and do it all at once. For both financial empowerment study and panache, the study is bilingual in French and English, and people can choose the language that they would like to do it in either English or French. And honorariums are provided, of course, for people who've completed the survey in both studies to acknowledge the time that they've taken to complete the study. So yeah, quickly, as we mentioned, we're currently enrolling for the panache study. It has been open since April of last year, and we're closing the study to data collection at the end of this month. Because of the risk of bots, we have been sharing doing our recruitment outreach and promotion in a very localized manner. We have been avoiding online methods of promotion, such as social media or e-publications, just to reduce our risk of attracting bot attention. We have printable flyers available, as well as digital flyers that can be shared, to trusted networks via email. So if you're interested in getting your hands on the flyers to share with people please reach out to me. I'd be happy to share those with you as well. I'm happy to answer any questions about the survey and the study generally. And I think that's about it for me.
Thanks, Christina. I'm just going to quickly wrap up and we can pass it off to our community members. Just want to highlight some key presentation takeaways. And thank you again, Christina, for highlighting the studies. I did send them to Ella to put in the chat, so people do have the links to that.
Awesome.
But yeah, we've covered a lot of information today, but whether this is new information to you or returning information, key presentation takeaways we have is U equals U as prevention, knowing and acknowledging that there are inequities among people living and aging with HIV, especially around aging. Older people living with HIV deserve unique resources and supports to age with dignity, and that people living with HIV would benefit from earlier geriatric referral if possible. And so before we transition over, I have to do an evaluation portion for this for those who are on the call in the webinar. Ella will launch a post-presentation poll just with 2 questions, and you can answer them honestly based on what you've learned. And we will resend this out later, but this is just another feedback survey that we have to gather. None of this work is possible without funding, so we do have to collect some information about that, and it will be circulated. And then if you are interested in connecting with us, our emails are here. I can also send them in the chat. But aside from that, thank you so much for having us. And I'm really excited to hear from our community members as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Realize team. Yeah, please feel free to take it away. Jim, Rebecca, and Ken invite you to introduce yourselves and provide your reflections.
Hi, my name is Jim Kane, and I was diagnosed with HIV in 1986, so I have 40 years of lived experience. And, I'm mindful of the fact that in 1986, there was not a lot of information that we have today. And it's a good thing that we do have a lot of more, because there was a lot of misconceptions. And the first wave of the HIV AIDS, and there was another condition, ARC, which we called it the purgatory in between, but that medical term was removed after a few years. Uh, yeah, there was a lot of stigma and discrimination and fear and panic and hysteria directed towards the gay community. But as we've learned over the years, HIV is an equal opportunity infector. The virus does not discriminate, people do. And, in the early days, we went on clinical drug trials, and a lot of those drug trials resulted in toxic side effects or side effects that were more serious. And, so it was hit and miss. And so you find at least with a lot of long-term survivors, those of us who are still lucky to be here, we do have a larger amount of comorbidities, usually around the pancreas, the kidneys, the liver, or the brain. And, I see specialists to deal with some of these comorbidities. And, so the physical thing is one thing, but probably the most serious thing was dealing with the effects of trauma on my mental health. And, it took a number of years, and I went I went through a course about 7 years ago on complex trauma and addictions, and it was a game changer for me. One of the things that long-term survivors, many of us, deal with is survivor guilt. Why am I still here and other people are not? And, I was seeing a counselor and he suggested, well, Jim, do you know the difference between guilt and false guilt? And I said, no. And he said, look it up and we'll talk next week. And guilt is when you feel guilty for something you did. False guilt is when you feel guilty for something you had no control over. And I had no control over how things played out, who lived, who's no longer with us and is in the spirit world. And I was able to let go of that false guilt, which so I think it's important as people have more lived experience that there's a huge emphasis on mental health, because stigma and discrimination is a key driver of erosion of your mental health. And, or a little correction about the Pride Parade, because that was 250 of us, not 25, but it was still a small crowd. They're expecting over 20,000 on Sunday, so it's come a long way. But that was one of the key methods that the gay community used to deal with stigma and discrimination. Instead of shame, we found pride. Instead of fear, we found courage. And today it's a completely different world. And, I'm truly saddened, though, that Manitoba's had to declare an HIV emergency. And, I don't have any real answers other than, if we can dig away at some of the causes of stigma and discrimination in the newly diagnosed, that would be a good thing. Thank you. That's it for me, Ken.
Okay, I guess. Hi, I'm Ken. Excuse me. 23 years ago next Thursday, I never thought that I'd ever see this day. That's when I was diagnosed with HIV and full-blown AIDS. So for years, I didn't even think about really growing old. I guess it started probably when I hit about 55. I went, Man, I'm getting old.
You're not alone.
And then the fear started setting in. How am I going to pay for my medication when I'm just on pension? Um, what's going to happen to me? Where am I going to live? What kind of care can I get? I've had different episodes of where people were absolutely wonderful when they discovered I was positive, and I've had other situations that um, I would never want to repeat. And this was in the medical profession. Like it was unbelievable. But enough of a rant on that. For myself, what are my concerns now going forward? I'm 66 now. So, what are my concerns going forward? Well, I'm still mobile. And I'm worried about what might happen when I'm not. Because I believe being mobile has a lot to do with being healthy. Um, my brain works 80% of the time. Others might quibble over that, but no, I mean that way I'm fine. I don't have any issues at all. Um, but it's still a worry. It's still a concern. Um, my vision. I'm always worried about my vision because my vision's not good and it continually gets worse. Uh, I'm worried about just my general health overall. I mean, I have come to the conclusion that HIV is not going to kill me. Something else will, and God, whoever somebody's been trying it. I mean, I've had a heart attack. I've had 5 stents put in. I had cancer. I beat it all. I beat Hep C. Um, you know, throw it at me. I'll take it on, kind of thing. Um, but I am very, very concerned about what I've seen in some personal care homes about how people are treated definitely different. And it's a stigma, but they're treated differently because they have HIV. And there should be no need for that. And that concerns me. And I think that the biggest solution to that is education. People aren't being taught about HIV anymore. They might get what maybe an hour out of all of high school. I mean, I don't know, but it's really not very much. But my concern is if we are having issues right now, what is going to happen in a couple of decades when these new diagnoses now almost become a flood of people going into personal care homes? If they're not ready now, they better get ready because it's coming. And that's my concern. I mean, I'm not too worried. I'm very much stand up for myself, and I don't let people tell me what I know is wrong. And I'm not too overly concerned about me going forward, but there's lots of people around me, you know,
Mhm.
um, that maybe aren't as strong. And basically, that's all. They said I had 10 minutes, but I knew I couldn't make 10 minutes, but I tried. Thank you, guys.
Hello?
Yeah, you're up, Rebecca.
Okay. So hi, my name is Rebecca. Um, so I was diagnosed in, I think it was my early 30s, and I just turned 49 this year. And a few things that I wanted to bring up was like, uh, that kind of really actually made sense to me about the false guilt and having no control over that. I went through that phase too because family members that have passed, and why am I still here? Um, One of the things that I've been thinking about, and a lot of people have been bringing up to my attention, is that when it comes to like palliative care and stuff like that, because like I'm just thinking about one of our elders in the community who's living in a is it an old folks home? It's a healthcare center here in the city in Winnipeg. And one of the things that they lack over there is they have no people that speak our language, no Ojibwe, no Cree people to communicate with our elders that are in there. Also too, they is very stigmatized for our people that are living with HIV in those homes, because other people that are living in those care homes, they don't have experience, and they don't understand what what our people are going through, especially the ones that are living with HIV in those personal care homes. And I can see our people going through like loneliness and stress because of the abuse they have to take from other clients who uh, can't come to uh, grips with understanding our two-spirited and our lived experience. What else is there? For like social assistance and stuff like that, like I noticed that there's lack of information coming from caseworkers, and also too, like I see some of our people within our own community too who struggle with like um finance, because they're trying to go to school, paying for their medication, paying for their rent, and all these things. And I just can't imagine like how hard the struggle is. And another thing too, like with my own experience I had with my own body, and it's with like my muscles. And at my young age, I had a hard time like with I think it might have been from the medication that made my muscles like tighten up and stuff like that, so it made it hard for me to move around and stuff like that, even after drinking like a lot of water during the day. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it from the top of my head that I can think of. Thanks for having me here today.
I have one more thing that I'd like to add. It was mentioned by in the presentation, undetectable equals untransmittable. And many of us activists have been lobbying the federal government for many years to reform the criminalization disclosure laws to reflect U equals U. They've endorsed U equals U. They made a commitment in the public apology in 2017 to reform these laws, but it's so far only been words and no action. And I think it's appalling, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah. Also, too, along with that, best time to start medication is one of the things that I see is an issue also, because when I first got diagnosed, the doctor told me it was up to me when I wanted to start my medication. I mean, well, when I think back to it, the sooner the better. That way I could have stayed undetectable when I was first diagnosed, instead of waiting till my my counts got low, like my blood cells. Yeah.
Any other comments From Ken, Jim, or Rebecca?
I'm good.
No, can't think of anything.
I think I'm good.
I just want to thank you three so much. Amazing insights. You're all so well spoken, and I think we all really appreciate your insights from the presentation today. We're going to open the floor to questions. Feel free to put your questions into the Q&A feature, and we will have all of our presenters available to answer your questions. To start us off, Jocelle, at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned PrEP and PEP, and we've talked a bit through the presentation and also from our community members about U equals U and HIV medication, but I'm wondering if you can expand just a little bit on what PrEP and PEP are for anyone in the audience that might not be aware. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. I'm also gonna make sure I have my reference notes because when it comes to medication, I never want to give inaccurate information, but essentially PrEP is a medication that you can take if you are I think anyone can take it. There isn't a specific population. As Jim had mentioned a long time ago, the virus does not discriminate. So really anyone who is sexually active with multiple partners can take PrEP as a way to prevent acquiring the HIV virus. And PEP is used after potential exposure. Let's say you're not taking PrEP and you might have been exposed to the virus. That would be the opportunity for you to take PEP. I'll just add a link in the chat in case anybody is interested in learning more about the specifics of that. But one is for preventative measures, other is preventative, just in case you weren't taking PrEP already.
Thank you. And we have a question that's come through here. The question is, what are the barriers or challenges for on reserve for people living with HIV? So I'm not sure if any of you can speak to that, but if you'd like to, please feel free to respond.
Well, from my experience, confidentiality, leaking of information and stuff like that. Even though we're trying to get out of the stigma phase, but when people are not ready for the reality of it, it becomes tormenting because like you feel shame and you know, like how people look down on you or think nasty thoughts of how you contracted it. And most of all too, like it's hard on parents, especially when like I have adult sons now, but my kids were still small when I first contracted the HIV virus. And I was afraid for my children and how people were gonna, you know, speak to them and say nasty things to them. Also too, like it's hard living on a reserve, especially if someone knows that you're going to the doctor for blood tests and all these kind of things, and they assume the worst of you and they don't want to help you, you know, even when you're hiring them to get to your doctor's appointments and stuff like that is very hard, even if it's your own family.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Someone also asks, building off that question, Rebecca and perhaps Ken and Jim might have some reflections on this as well. Building off that question, what kind of supports have made the biggest difference in your life?
Well, for me, it's probably, um, and I hate to knock give them a knock out of the park, but probably Nine Circles. I mean, getting my health care there, it's been excellent. I have no, uh, it's it really has changed my life, um, and made me confident that I still got a long time to go. But yeah, that would probably be the biggest thing. Running a very, very close second is my partner. She has been an amazing support through a lot of stuff. So,
I'm curious,
I'd also,
Ken, or sorry, just to follow up on your answer, Ken, just for folks that are in the room here who are um, front line service providers or who are interacting with people in different capacities, what are some of the things specifically that stand out to you about your experience at Nine Circles that maybe folks on this call could think about as they're interacting with people?
oh boy. Well, I think the very first thing um, was probably when I met my first doctor at Nine Circles. I'd gone into the clinic and I was registering in that, and the person at the desk says, "Oh, you're going to see so and so today or something." And my doctor was walking by, and she goes, "Nope, I'm keeping him. He's mine." And um, just the laid back attitude was like, "How are you doing?" It was asking me what I wanted to do. It wasn't telling me what to do. Um, the other supports that were there when I first went to Nine Circles. I was terrified to go there because in my mind that was the gay place, and I wasn't going there. And then I broke down eventually because I had to. But the support staff that were there for food or mental health or all everything, like it just those things all just made life a lot simpler.
I would like to piggyback on that because one of the biggest supports for me was peer support. I mean, it was great to have doctors and medical staff, but it was also knocked it out of the park when you were dealing with people that were dealing with the same issues you had, and you could identify with their feelings and they could identify with yours.
Likewise. But I was stigmatized too when I first went there because to me, I was judging the same people that, you know, I'm around every day. And but my supports came from the other ladies and the groups that they had there, like they used to have the PHA community members where you can vote in who you wanted to represent our people within the community at Nine Circles. There was that, and they had like traditional ceremonies and stuff like that, drumming, sweats. Um, they took us out to retreats and stuff like that. Um, they had art classes. They have the food bank, and these last couple of years, like I have a support worker there. So they have actually a lot of support workers there, and they've all helped me. And so it was Nine Circles and Gani Ganichik for me.
Thank you all so much. Another question here. How has U equals U affected your sense of self, relationships, or future as you've gotten older?
Well, for me, it was something I had to try and figure out in my head because I was so tuned at that time that, condom, condom, condom. You can't, there was no talk about being able to have unprotected sex with anyone. And then when that came out, I mean, that was a game changer in the sense that, okay, we could be a little bit more natural now if we wanted to. But then there was always still that fear, and Jim touched on it earlier about, yes, you equals you, but I still didn't disclose. So, I can still be charged apparently. Um, so I mean, there's that. Um, it's great. I mean, can't ask for anything better. And it does give a better outlook maybe for some of the younger people, knowing that, yes, this can happen and they can still have family and stuff like that.
I'd like to answer that question as well. I see it's from Randy Davis, who I recognize as somebody who championed U equals U. So kudos to Randy. And how has it affected my sense of self? Well, for many years, we didn't have these treatments. Our viral load was unstable, and I really felt like a diseased piece of excrement. And it affected my self-esteem and everything. And, luckily I had some friends and people that stood by me, and then it was like the whole world changed after the cocktail came out and, things got better. And I felt better about myself when I knew, even though I was always playing safe, but I knew that I couldn't infect anybody else because I never wanted anybody to deal with the disease that I had dealt with for the last 40 years. And so, if someone is diagnosed today, I can share with them that, it doesn't have to be that way. There's ways you can protect yourself and others by staying linked up to treatment, and it can make a world of difference. And this is HIV is no longer a death sentence. It can be a chronic manageable disease if you're on treatment.
Anything
That's
you'd
it.
like to share on that one, Rebecca? U equals U.
Well, to be honest, like I don't really think about it too much. It's not really brought up enough. But it is lacking though, because like a lot of people don't understand and they don't realize. And one of the girls from our Sisters of Fire, she brings it up and she's the only one that ever brings it up. And when she did bring it up there, I totally forgot all about it. And it's kind of funny though, because like um even one of my doctors, like I guess he must have been just like on practice, but he was taking over for my doctor that day. And I asked him about the U equals U, and he's like, "What? What is that?" And I was like, "What do you mean, what is that? I'm asking you. You're supposed to know this." So yeah, it really there needs to be more talk about it, more education.
For sure. A nice segue perhaps into the second part of this question, which some of you have touched on, but what advice would you give to someone who is diagnosed with HIV today and is thinking about what their future might look like?
Well, for me, I wouldn't glamorize it, but I would say that you can still live healthy as long as you're on medication and taking care of yourself. Living healthy.
Mm.
I would just, yeah, tell them, like, it's like Jim said, it's not a death sentence. You're going to live a long, healthy life. You're probably going to die from something else because the treatment now is so successful. Um, yeah, it's not something that you need to fear. Your life will be just as normal as anybody else.
I think I already answered that.
Awesome. Thanks all three of you. Really nice question here. In recognition of HIV Long-Term Survivors Awareness Day, which again is tomorrow, what lessons from long-term survivors do you think the broader HIV movement cannot afford to lose?
I think I can answer that. One thing that we cannot afford to lose is the fact that so many of us in the early days put our hands up and went on clinical drug trials. And we allowed science to evolve because we were willing to put our hands up. And so I don't want the broader HIV community to ever forget that.
I agree because I went to this peer leadership in Saskatchewan, and I was just so like amazed on how far the people ahead of us had done so much work, and I am just so grateful to be a part of that experience because like seeing how far they came and how far we are to this day. And it makes me very proud and I'm very grateful for them.
I really don't have much to add. I don't think it's all been said.
And a comment here from Randy Davis, who asked some of these fantastic questions. Thank you all for your comments and for sharing of yourself so authentically. Another question here. In general, have you seen attitudes toward HIV change over time, or are there still big misconceptions that you still encounter today?
Um,
So.
always almost. I mean, here's something else.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, it might be Rebecca.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Or something here. What was the question?
In general, have you seen attitudes towards HIV change over time, or are there still big misconceptions that you still encounter today?
I say it's so. Some people have changed and some people just are so hung up on it with their own ideas, I guess.
I think, that I have to agree with Rebecca in some cases. There's still some people that are hung up on it. But in general, the healthcare community has grown in their understanding and appreciation for HIV and all the complex variants of the clientele they deal with from all walks of life. And I think they're more sensitive to it today than they were, when I was diagnosed in 1986.
Um, I think there still is some misconceptions. Um, my friend of mine, his his daughter-in-law was just went ballistic when they found out about him having HIV, and it turned out that she just didn't understand it. She was still back in the 80s, and I still think there's some people, and it may be very very discreetly done, but there's some people that still have things about or fears or issues that they don't understand or misconceptions. So it's not like it was definitely totally different, but I believe it's still there. And I've
Yeah.
experienced it a couple times myself.
Mhm.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? We have about 5 more minutes if there's any other questions that folks would like to ask any of our presenters from today. Are there any more reflections that you would like to provide from the questions or from the presentation before we wrap up?
I just want to say one thing, just from experience. Like it is very scary when you do get a doctor who is very young and has their own control issues and don't really want to be there to help. We need people that actually want to be there to help.
Mhm. Any other last minute reflections or comments?
No, I just, last thing is I just want to grow old, healthy, and happy. That's all I want to do. And I don't want to have to worry about someone going off the deep edge because I'm positive. Um, that's all it is. That's what I want.
Happy Pride, everyone.
Happy
Happy
Pride.
Pride, everyone.
Happy Pride.
All right, on that note, I want to thank all of you for your time today, our presenters, our panel, everyone who made the time to attend today, and everyone who may be watching this recording. We thank you all so much. And again, a really big thank you to Realize, Jocelle, and Christina for your time today, and to Rebecca, Jim, and Ken for your time today, and for your openness to share your reflections and experiences. We really appreciate your time and hope you all have a very happy Pride.
Thank you.
All
Thank you
right.
so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Do you have pride?